Dear friends, welcome to eContent developed on Session 12, Victorian Literature Part 2, BA Optional English, 5th semester, Davangere University. Recap of Victorian poetry. Learning objectives: to understand the features of Victorian poetry, to understand the Victorian poetic concepts, dramatic monologue, and sprung rhythm. Session outcomes: students will be able to identify the characteristics of Victorian poetry, identify the Victorian poets. Contents: recap on introduction to prescribed syllabus, Matthew Arnold's poem Dover Beach and Shakespeare, Thomas Hardy's Penpathy, The Satin Shoes, G.M. Hopkins' Thou Art Indeed Just Lord, and The Windower, Christina Rossetti's In an Artist Studio, and Remember. Recap on introduction to prescribed syllabus, introduction to Victorian age. Victorian era was one of the most important period in the history of English literature. During this period, England acquired unprecedented power and wealth, and the country extended across the globe because of its empire, political stability, and revolutionary developments in transport and communication. And we can see many of the intellectual and cultural achievements of in this period. And in the sixth paper, we have 3 units. In the first unit, we have 4 major Victorian poets. First, Matthew Arnold and his 2 poems, Dover Beach and Shakespeare. Thomas Hardy's Penpathy and The Satin Shoes. G.M. Hopkins' Thou Art Indeed Just Lord and The Windower. Christina Rossetti's In an Artist Studio and Remember. In the second unit, we have 2 major Victorian prose writers. First, J.S. Mill and his work Anne Liberty. Second, T.B. Macaulay and his work Macaulay's Minutes on Education. Finally, in the third unit, we have one fiction, that is Great Expectations by famous Victorian novelist Charles Dickens. Recap on introduction to Arnold's Dover Beach. In this session, we have learned about Matthew Arnold's life and works, Matthew Arnold as a poet, and major themes of his poems like this: anti-modernization, faith, nature, love, time, classical mythology, and labor. And introduction to Dover Beach. This poem was first published in 1867 in the collection of new poems, and the poem is divided into 4 stanzas. And this poem is a dramatic monologue because of single speech by the speaker. Here, the speaker of the poem, probably Arnold, and he addressed it to his wife. Then next session, Arnold's Dover Beach. In the poem, the speaker is on the beach watching the calm sea and the full tide, and he invites his beloved to enjoy with him the calm sea and beautiful night. The speaker compares the receding waves to the decay of spiritual faith. Finally, the speaker turns to his beloved, saying that it is in our sincerity and love that we can find solace in a world full of deception and uncertainty. Next, recap on introduction to Arnold's Shakespeare. This poem was published in 1849, and Arnold expresses great reverence for Shakespeare. Matthew Arnold, being impressed by Shakespeare's artistic abilities, wrote this famous sonnet in his honor. The poem is composed in the form of a sonnet, neither Petrarchan nor Shakespearean sonnet. And this poem includes poetic devices like this: repetition, alliteration, metaphor, and personification. Matthew Arnold's Shakespeare. The poem deals with Shakespeare's literary greatness, Shakespeare's abilities compared to that of mountain top. Shakespeare received no scholarly. Nature and experience were his guide and teacher. He was understood by his fellow men. Shakespeare became the voice of people. These are the major highlights of the poem. Hardy's Penpathy. In this session, we have been discussed Thomas Hardy's life and works. Thomas Hardy is a famous novelist, poet, and short story writer. This poem, Penpathy or Green Slates, suggests a place surrounded with greenery and of trees. A man is reminded of his beloved by slates on rooftops, having met her 50 years earlier in a quarry. Impact of industrialization we can see in this poem, and love and nature are the major themes in this poem. Now, Hardy's The Satin Shoes. This poem, a quiet tragedy, the tale of a beautiful woman. The protagonist has the heart's desire to walk on her wedding day in satin shoes. Her desire seems to be at the core of her personality. She was so sad about not being able to wear satin shoes to her wedding that it drove her mad. Now, G.M. Hopkins, thou art indeed just Lord. In this session, we have learned G.M. Hopkins' life and works. And G.M. Hopkins was a famous Victorian poet and Jesuit priest, and this poem was published in 1889. The poem is in the form of Petrarchan or Italian sonnet. The poem is religious in nature. The sonnet is taken from the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible. A recap on G.M. Hopkins' The Windower. Sprung rhythm. Hopkins called his own rhythmic structure sprung rhythm. This technique he introduced in this poem. This poem is a semi-romantic religious poem dedicated to Christ. It is a sonnet in the Italian form, was composed on May 30 in 1877. Hopkins called The Windower the best thing ever wrote. The speaker of the poem describes a bird which he saw flying in the sky like in a romantic poem. Then Christina Rossetti is in an artist studio. In this session, we discussed Christina Rossetti's life and works and her poetic career. This poem focuses on male desire and the representation of women as objects of the male gaze. Rossetti challenges the sonnet by writing about obsession and female oppression. The poem is about the male artist's tendency to objectify his female sitters or models for his paintings and sculptures. Then Rossetti's Remember. It is a classic Victorian poem written in 1849 and published in 1862 in her first volume Goblin Market and Other Poems. This is a Petrarchan sonnet in iambic pentameter, and the poem deals with the struggle between physical existence and the afterlife, it means death. The narrator, who presumably represents Rossetti, addresses her beloved and encourages him to remember her after her death. Finally, here we have Assignments. Briefly explain major trends of Victorian age. Critically examine the poem Dover Beach. Explain literary greatness of Shakespeare and Matthew Arnold's poem Shakespeare. What is the significance of the poem Penpathy? Describe the protagonist's obsession with satin shoes. Critically analyze the poem Thou Art Indeed Just Lord. Attempt a critical appreciation of the poem The Windover. Examine the theme of Christina Rossetti's in an artist studio. Write a critical appreciation of Christina Rossetti's poem Remember. Thank you.